Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. President Trump's one-man foreign policy is becoming a three-ring circus driven by his mercurial personality and ego. The New York Times reported this morning the White House has developed a plan to force out Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, whose relationship with President Trump has been strained, and replace him with Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, perhaps within the next several weeks. Trump today dodged questions about Tillerson's future. Let's listen.
Do you want Rex Tillerson on the job, Mr. President? He's here. Do you want him to stay in his job?
Thanks, everyone.
Well, it's been widely reported that Tillerson, who has often disagreed with the president on policy, could leave the administration by the year's end. In October, NBC News reported that Tillerson had openly disparaged the president, referring to him as a moron. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly was said to have put the plan in place, but both State Department and White House officials publicly say Tillerson isn't going anywhere yet.
What I can tell you is that that Chief of Staff Kelly called our department this morning and said that the rumors are not true, that those reports are not true.
When it comes to questions like this of senior staff and cabinet secretaries, when the president loses confidence in somebody, they'll no longer be here. As the president said on the record, and several of you were in the room in the Oval today, the Secretary of State is here.
Well, the potential shakeup on the national security team comes after Trump spent the better part of the last 24 hours creating his own series of international crises. Trump's retweet of a series of inflammatory anti-Muslim videos posted by a leader of the far-right nationalist Britain First Party drew a sharp rebuke from British Prime Minister Theresa May, whose office called it wrong. Trump responded by tweeting, "Theresa May, don't focus on me. Focus on the destructive radical Islamic terrorism that is taking place within the United Kingdom. We're doing just fine." But May is standing her ground.
But the fact that we work together does not mean that we're afraid to say when we think the United States have got it wrong, and to be very clear with them. And I'm very clear that retweeting from Britain First was the wrong thing to do.
The wrong thing to do. Anyway, the Washington Post's Ashley Parker notes that the inflammatory tweets were just the latest example of Trump, quote, veering past the guardrails of presidential behavior, writing, Trump has internalized the belief that he can largely operate with impunity. His political base cheers him on. Fellow Republican leaders largely stand by him. His staff scrambles to explain away his misbehavior or even to laugh it off. And the White House disciplinarian, Chief of Staff John Kelly, has said it's not his job to control the president. Wow. For more, I'm joined by the author of that article, Ashley Parker, White House reporter for The Washington Post. Yamiche Alcindor is national political reporter for The New York Times. And Nayyera is a former State Department senior advisor. Thank you, all three. Let's start with Ashley. Ashley Parker, I thought that was pretty poetic, but pretty scary, because you basically ran through all the guardrails, staff, people in the leadership of the White House, the chief of staff. No one seems to have any control over the president's meandering into trouble.
That's right. And no one, let's be clear, has ever really had that much control over this president. But the thing that seems new now in talking to people inside and outside the White House is that Trump himself feels emboldened. He feels that he hasn't really felt the consequences of many of his comments or tweets or decisions. And so, for instance, with the Russia probe, he believes, contrary to a lot of evidence, that it will be over by the end of the year. On the Access Hollywood tape, he is now the most high-profile man who has been accused of sexual misconduct and has faced no ramifications. And aides today told me that if tax reform passes through, he will certainly feel the wind at his sails, and we could see more of this sort of behavior.
Well, I guess he's also counting on winning down in Alabama with Roy Moore. But anyway, let's get back to this. It seems, Yamiche, that if the word's out that your foreign minister, the Secretary of State in our country, is on his way out, and on his way out in fairly quick time, he's not much of a representative to this country, for this country.
No, and
it's useless.
I mean, and part of it is that President Trump has been undercutting him for months. There's this idea that Rex Tillerson said that he was going to try to work on North Korea, and then President Trump tweeted that he was wasting his time and that there was no really option there, that so he essentially has always been for months his own Department of State. He's always been kind of talking about State Department and talking about foreign relations on Twitter. That's how he does it. He governs on Twitter, and I think that in this case we're starting to see the real ramifications, where you have Britain basically almost revoking this invite to President Trump to come there.
Nayyera, who's setting U.S. foreign policy in the big picture? Questions like North Korea, things like that. all those issues, trade, everything. Who is really setting the course for our country now? Anyone?
There doesn't really seem to be much of a course, actually. I mean, he spent 12 days touring Asia, and we have no ambassadors there, and nobody can actually point to any one deliverable of what the United States gained other than a military parade and some pomp and circumstance for Donald Trump. He clearly has a military fetish and has surrounded himself in his leadership with people who either are in uniform or used to wear military uniform. Rex Tillerson does not fit that mold. So not only does he not have the direct trust of the president, he also does not have any empowerment from the rest of the staff to do the job of diplomacy. This is signaled to the rest of the world that the United States is no longer interested in being diplomatic and, in fact, is going to probably use war as its first option.
Let me go to Ashley on this. I don't know whether you have the judgment or the ability, the ability to judge this, but it seems a lot you've got a big corporate ego in Tillerson, Rex Tillerson. He's a big shot. He's head of a big oil company. He came in here at the top of his game, at the top of his world, which is oil, and being a CEO of a big corporation, one of the biggest. He comes in as basically an adjutant, a deputy to a president. Has he adjusted to that role? And has Trump accepted him as a deputy or as a partner or what? Who is Rex Tillerson in terms of setting U.S. foreign policy?
So I think the answer to both of those questions is no. And this is something you often find, and you even see this with the president a little bit, that there are people who are very successful in business, in corporate America, and that skill set, for whatever reason, does not quite translate to managing a major, complicated bureaucracy. In this case, too, Rex Tillerson had some additional challenges in that he was the deputy working for a fairly mercurial boss who was, as we mentioned earlier in the show, sort of making foreign policy on the fly on Twitter. But it was a relationship that was never particularly warm or successful, and then just increasingly deteriorated over the months.
Yamiche, we all, people my age, grew up with the Cuban Missile Crisis, thinking about how in XCOM, a group of 12 men in those days, it was all men in those days, figured out how to deal with the threat of nuclear missiles in Cuba and how to get them out of Cuba without causing a war in Berlin or somewhere else. Who is that group today? Who is that cohesive set of people, men and women, I presume? Well, I don't presume anything, I'll be honest. Is there anybody sitting there, how do we deal with Kim Jong-un? What if he does this? What if he does that? What if he drops a nuclear weapon, explodes in the middle of the Pacific? Is that the red line? And if so, what do we do?
I think that there are career people that are at the State Department that are absolutely trying to think those through. The problem with this is that President Trump, at the end of the day, is really the CEO of the entire U.S. government in that he doesn't really want to give anyone power. And
who puts the options on his table? A, B, C, D?
I think a lot of it is the generals. A lot of it I think those are probably the #1 people that he respects the most because you think of Rex Tillerson calling him a moron, and I think that he's still very much angry about that. So I would say that it's mainly the generals, and I think that calling John Kelly the disciplinarian in the White House is pretty clear. But who he actually pays attention to are all the people that he calls up on the phone. Roger Ailes, all these other people that are kind of just out in the world. Steve Bannon.
Years ago, Roger Ailes.
And here's what happens when you devolve.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you devolve everything to generals and military options, there really isn't anybody at the table discussing what the diplomatic solutions could be. And you have Rex Tillerson, who, instead of spending his time empowering the diplomats, seems to be driving them out the door, giving them offers to terminate their tours early. They're not bringing any new classes of Foreign Service officers.
Yeah.
And diplomats have the experience of being in multiple different places. Having that, Rex Tillerson himself has only been in one company his entire life and is trying to manage the State Department, a sprawling bureaucracy with multiple languages and multiple countries under its purview, as if he's running Exxon.
Well, I just keep worrying that we're not worrying about Exxon. We're worrying about nuclear war with North Korea or a second Korean war. Anyway, despite the blowback from the British Prime Minister, Sarah Sanders once again defended the president's reposting of that anti-Muslim tweet. Let's watch.
Does he understand, though, that sharing those videos might incite violence against Muslims? And does he understand that he's elevated a fringe political group that many people outside of Britain didn't even know about until...
Look, I think what he's done is elevate the conversation to talk about a real issue and a real threat. That's extreme violence and extreme terrorism, something that we know to be very real and something the president feels strongly about talking about and bringing up and making sure is an issue every single day, that we're looking at the best ways to protect Americans.
Well, I guess let me go back to Ashley on this again, and I think that What do you make of that question, this fundamental question? Who is setting our policy around the world right now? Who is dealing with, the kind of tactical decisions that have to be made in a split second? If Kim Jong-un does something that really forces us to do something, who's the one that walks into the White House, walks into the Oval Office and says, Mr. President, here's your 3 options? Who's doing that?
I think, again, at the core, President Trump is the president. He is making the final decision. And as we saw with Sarah Sanders, the White House is sort of scrambling to respond to stuff that they're not expecting. And ideally, they wouldn't have to defend. But in terms of if you're asking who are the adults who walk into the Oval Office, I think there is still a sense that it is sort of the generals. It is General Kelly. It is McMaster. It is Mattis. It's obviously not quite Tillerson anymore, but there are sort of these adults around him who people have correctly or incorrectly pinned their hopes on, can sort of reason with the president if that's what the situation requires.
Well, Nayyera, usually, sometimes like we deal with the Israelis, for example, a very smart governing group. I think they're playing chess, we're playing checkers, but right now I don't know even if we're up to checkers. And I think about Netanyahu. Is he worried about Jared Kushner and what he's up to? Is he worried about Tillerson? Apparently not. Is he still trying to shine up the president? I mean, how do you, if you're a smart foreign leader, find the way to the brain of our country now?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we're playing a big game of sorry when we should be playing chess, as you said. And really, you have diplomats in foreign countries and heads of state who are horrified at what Donald Trump is doing to the United States legacy. The United States has been known for promoting democracy, civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion around the world. Instead, with the language coming out of the White House, you have attacks on the basic fundamentals of democracy. That emboldens people like these fringe far-right groups, like people who would like to see military coups in Africa and dictatorships in Latin America, instead of the people that we are allied with who are trying to spread the idea of democracy.
Well said.
I also think if you're a foreign leader, you're having to deal with a personality that changes and somewhat erratic. You see these foreign leaders that are trying to flatter President Trump as a way of just kind of
big dinner.
Yeah, with big dinners, big rugs. You see him in the Philippines, and he's kind of being brought up on stage and being made to feel well. And these foreign leaders understand that they have to get President Trump to like them personally. That he feels as though he's really being flattered for us to be safe, essentially.
This is embarrassing. Meanwhile, Axios is reporting that White House officials expect Trump to get even more outrageous in coming months, saying he seems more prone to confidently indulging wild conspiracies and fantasies, more quick triggered to fight. I get back to you, Ashley, on the reporting here. The president doesn't seem to be learning on the job. He doesn't seem any better today than yesterday. It's like Groundhog's Day. It begins at 6:30 in the morning when he reads the papers and retweets something or tweets something in anger in reaction to what he just read. There doesn't seem to be progress in terms of his sophistication, to put it lightly.
I think it goes back to a couple things. I think it goes back to what we talked about a bit earlier about him feeling emboldened, that, as you just said, there certainly are consequences for his behavior. He was just publicly rebuked by the British Prime Minister, but he doesn't necessarily feel those consequences. He also views himself as a counterpuncher. He sort of thinks he's at his best when he's in a one-on-one fight. And some of these issues and fights he's picking and stances he's taking, especially when it comes to sort of the culture war fronts, is stuff his base loves. And if there's one group he knows he can't lose, because they are, quite frankly, right now the only group with him, it's his base.
This whole thing is haywire. Thank you, Ashley Parker, and it's dangerous. Yamiche Alcindor and Nayyera Hack. Coming up, Attorney General Jeff Sessions would